Welcome back to Building a Fighter. My name is Dr. Austin Schoen, sports chiropractor in Scottsdale, Arizona. With me, as always, badass strength coach in Denver, Colorado, Alex Friedman. We are coming at you guys with a part two on one of our most popular podcasts we've done. So, originally we had the top 5 movements for MMA that you are missing. Today, we're throwing a part 2 at you guys. We're giving you top 5 movements and concepts that we feel like you guys are not doing at home that can elevate your strength and conditioning for combat sports. And Alex, what is technically number 6, but number 1 today?
6/1. Our first one that we see a lot of is like med balls are extremely popular and used quite often, but we think we can improve the way that you use med balls, improve the way that everybody uses med balls specifically for MMA, right? Which is adding variety, which is adding almost like a double impact, which is mixing it up, using some rotational power, using a slam to a toss, using things that preload and get the stretch shortening cycle going rather than like just our one-offs of med ball slam or lateral toss into the wall. Like there's so many different avenues to pursue with medicine balls that can be really beneficial for MMA. But what we see a lot of times is just a lot of the straightforward exercises with it. So some of those avenues that we think are worth exploring are, like I said, some of the multiple impact drills that we do, like a rotational slam to a wall throw. I think that, again, really emphasizes some of the MMA specificity. And then rotation in general, right? You don't have to slam the ball in front of you. You don't have to throw it to your side. You can rotate all the way side to side, which is a pretty unique variable with med balls.
100%. And on top of all of this, like talk about training concepts. I feel as though we don't use med balls enough in the extensive plyometric terms
Yeah,
versus
love
the
that.
intensive plyometric terms, which what that means is we use med balls for power almost exclusively. But med balls are a fantastic tool to train plyometric endurance or that extensive plyometric movement. So I'll use it a lot for like lateral tosses, and we're going to do that for fucking 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, and hit a lactic burn as we go. Where we're getting a bunch of contacts. They're not going to be at 100%, but we're going to train that stretch shortening cycle over and over and over again because I believe one of the most underrated skills in mixed martial arts and combat sports that's trained, or I guess not trained, in strength and conditioning is extensive plyometrics of the upper body.
Yeah.
In a sport that punching and kicking, but mostly punching is one of the main avenues of success. And a lot of punching, think about throwing out a jab. That's not a power jab every time, right? We need to be able to have that plyometric endurance where we're going through, we're going to double up our jab. We're going to over and over and over again be able to throw kind of like Colby Covington at 75, 80%. That's where our extensive plyos kind of come in. So whether it's like something I've been doing a lot recently, it's 2 birds, 1 stone, extensive plyometric and lactate threshold or lactate conditioning, where we'll get a med ball chest pass. We're going to do that 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off. And it's a light med ball, just pop, 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 pop,
Yeah.
pop, pop, pop. It doesn't have to be at 100%, but we're keeping a consistent rhythm as we go. We're getting that lactate accommodation. We're getting that lactate fatigue essentially, but we're also getting that extensive plyometric as we're doing that stretch shortening cycle over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I think that feeds really well into like even progressing our med ball work to that intensive place. One of my favorite things to do, like early on GPP, is get some of those are rubbery, bouncy med balls, right? Typically a throwaway gym item that kind of are nonsense. You take them against the wall. I put my athletes on like a 60-second circuit where they do overhead dribbles, chest pass dribbles, hip dribbles, and then they take about 45 to 60 seconds, and they're constantly dribbling that med ball, getting a rhythm, getting like tension built up through that extensive upper body plyo, right? Then we can progress that almost that same progression into some of our bigger Dynamax balls, which require a little bit more power. We're trading off a little bit of like extensive for intensive. And then that just lends its way down the chain to be better able to utilize our intensive med ball work. Because one of the biggest caveats with our med ball work is like, well, you have to be good at a med ball throw. You have to be good at it to get
Yeah.
it's like, okay, so let's fucking practice being good at it. Like it's not that
Right. Well,
hard.
exactly what you said. I know the 10,000 hour rule is kind of a myth, but like learning a whole bunch of stuff and doing it a bunch of times works.
Yeah.
right? It doesn't have to be 10,000 hours. Like I hate when people are like, "Oh, outliers doesn't matter. Like that book doesn't work." Just because it didn't end up being 10,000 hours doesn't mean the concept isn't correct. The more practice you put into something, typically the better you're going to be.
Yeah.
And extensive plyos, what you can do over and over and over again is perfect that form of how you're exploding. Say you're doing a alternating repetitive med ball hip toss where you're going for 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. Well, that's 30 reps over and over and over again for anywhere between probably 6 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So that's in the course of 10 minutes, you just threw that med ball, if I'm doing my math right, 300 times, 150 per side. That's 150 chances to get better as you go. Instead of if we're doing intensive where you're really only doing 2 to 4 reps max, that's not as good of a stimulus to help pattern that or rotational pattern that we're trying to get better at. So it's a
Yeah.
great way to, and we know that typically we want to go endurance to power. That's how our brain operates for the most part. So being able to get the endurance factor, understand the concepts with which my body's trying to move, and then try to overload that pattern by adding in the increased stimuli of increased intensity or increased weight as we go is a great way for my brain to understand how we want it to rotate, not necessarily how it's currently rotating that may or may not be efficient.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that goes back to our principle that like strength is a skill, right? Like anything you're doing in the weight room, you have to at least build, and maybe they're a little more accessible. Maybe they're letter or less complex skills, but they're skills nonetheless, right? I have to practice getting good at a squat if I want to squat heavy well, right? And so it's like, I have to practice throwing the med ball and practicing throwing the med ball. Every skill development technique we do on the mat, tactical, general, whatever it is, requires this like volume block or this technical practice block. Right. And so this is where we can plug this in with our med balls, just doing simple things like Austin says, like increasing your intervals and doing more work with the med ball in an extensive fashion, ramping up a progression. Like, okay, maybe I see a sick building a fighter YouTube short, right? I
Yes.
want to be able to do that med ball exercise at that level, really fucking cool, like Tommy Gun does,
Yeah, they're sick
whatever,
as fuck. I
right?
agree. As the
So
person that edits them.
I I knew you'd love that. Roll that back and look at like, okay, what's an individual piece of that? Okay, he's doing a rotational med ball slam before he throws to the wall. Okay, so let me do my 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off with a rotational med ball slam, which as you get good at that will suck. You
Yep.
know,
Fuck
that's
yeah.
good lactic conditioning as well. Okay, now I've done a block or two of working on rotational med ball slams. Okay, the second part of that is he's doing a hip toss right into the wall, you know, front facing. Okay, let me work on that and build that skill. And then now in my power block or my like cumulative block, I'll put them together and then I'll look like fucking Tommy Gun throwing the sick med ball into the wall and I'll put some
Bingo.
music on it. And now I'm making my own YouTube shorts.
Exactly. And then tag us because then we get more content. No, it's I guess the boils it down to just be more creative with the way you use med balls. Use your extensive to pattern the med ball movements, and then don't be afraid to add in the multi levels, like Alex is saying, because they're so fucking important. MMA isn't a explode once in isolation sport. No combat sport is, unfortunately. So we need to be able to explode multiple times in a given pattern. That's where our multi level med ball movements really take over and reign supreme. Alex, what's the next underrated movement we're talking about?
So honestly, on a similar kind of note, is adding variety in our kettlebell swings.
Yes,
Right? I don't think kettlebell swings are a hidden or underrated exercise anymore.
I do.
Um,
I don't think enough people use them in general. I think they're, and I personally think that they are the most underutilized movement for MMA because the concept of bracing that you need to do a kettlebell swing is almost exclusively the same as throwing a punch or a kick.
yeah, the double impulse.
The double
Yeah,
impulse that
I
you get
agree.
from a kettlebell swing, any of them that we're going to talk about, is almost the exact same bracing strategy as throwing a strike or
Gotcha.
taking a shot in wrestling. And I would bet you probably less than 50% of programs for combat sports athletes have some sort of kettlebell swing in them.
Yeah, I guess I've been around a lot of programs that do utilize the kettlebell swing, but utilizing kettlebell swing and then adding variety to it as well, using it in many different contexts. And in, like we said, the med ball, you can progress it up and down the chain. So awesome. Dig into that. Explain to me why throwing kettlebell swing is the same as throwing a punch.
So we got to be able to brace our core as we go through, right? We know that muscles pull. And the best way to increase our force generation or power generation is to have the muscles have a more stable surface to pull off of. And what kettlebell swings do so well is we have a double impulse as we go. We load the kettlebell swing, we have to brace. In order for the kettlebell to float up, it has to generate speed similar to like a punch. So let's explain it in form of punch first, because that's easier to understand. So when I'm throwing, say, a heavy cross, for example, I need to generate a massive amount of core stability or bracing strategy to generate the force to initiate my punch. Then that force needs to turn into speed so that my punch can gain speed or momentum going towards my opponent. And then right when I get to the opponent, that speed turns into stability again. I need to be able to brace as maximally as possible so that I can then transmit my force through that opponent's dome. And I'm going from that knockout punch. Think about, this is literally the day after Alex Bahia just threw that dirty ass head kick on Yuri
Yep.
Prochazka yesterday. Like, for him to be able to land that left high switch kick, he needs a massive amount of bracing strategy, then be able to relax as much as possible for his leg to float up to the head, and then right at impact with the head, he needs to generate a maximal brace in order to transmit the speed and the power he just generated through Yuri's dome. So a kettlebell swing is extremely similar, if not the exact same bracing strategy, because we have to initiate the kettlebell swing. And then if I'm doing a proper kettlebell swing, my arms just fucking float up to generate force. And then as we go for the next one, we have to boom, initiate, go, initiate, go, initiate, go, where it's a double impulse over and over and over again, where I'm stopping momentum, starting momentum, stopping momentum, starting momentum, but then also generating the speed with which I'm trying to train. This, for me, is one of my favorite concepts to train the bracing strategy and try to fix, without going too far down the rabbit hole, the extension, compression, stability strategy of these athletes just using their low back muscles to stabilize instead of breathing and trying to expand into the posterior to generate as stable of a spine as possible. But so it's a twofer for me. Kettlebell swings, whether we're doing sagittal or just straight up and down that most people do, or rotational, which I love to implement with my combat sports athletes, which I want to talk about. It's the same bracing strategy to develop that force, develop that speed, and then be able to fix the biomechanics of efficiently stabilize as I'm going through a striking cascade.
Oh yeah, and a lot of the way to think about this double impact theory is like, what do you do when you land a punch or you initiate a kick or you
Yeah.
breathe, you exhale, right? Yeah, you create that sound and like that's where you're like building rigidity or your bracing is so tied to your breath, right? I see so many people that like I'll tell them to do a set at 10 kettlebell swings. They like, and I'm holding my breath for 10 kettlebell swings in a row. It's like not the strategy that we're after there. So I think teaching the breathing alongside of that is synonymous with teaching a correct bracing strategy, right?
Right. And well, for that too, it's kettlebell swings. I don't want this to be a love affair with kettlebell swings because they aren't perfect, right? But
Sounds like you love them a lot.
I just think they're extremely underutilized because the other thing is we can teach fatigue resistance, right? What's something that happens as we go through a fight? Our power starts to drop off because we can't brace as well. We're not able to get as rigid as possible because as soon as I hit a fatigue, once I hit my threshold or critical threshold of fatigue, I'm not able to use the skill-based fatigue. I'm going to revert back to whatever pattern is the safest for my brain. Well, what can we do with kettlebell swings? Instead of doing them for 5 reps for just power and we're adding on weight or whatever, we can do it in a metabolic circuit where we're training our actual bracing strategy over and over and over again and trying to train the stability of the exercise. It all comes down to, like, I made a video for the YouTube for understanding combat sports, like intent drives results.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of why I like the kettlebell swing is we can get a bunch of different results based on the intent I'm trying to get with the exercise. I can use this exercise in a lot of different ways to get a lot of different results. I just need to be a good enough coach to relay that message to my athletes of, hey, I'm not looking for you to fucking pop your hip every single time. I'm not looking for maximal power unless I am. But if I'm looking for the fatigue resistance, then it's, hey, I need you to do this. We're trying to stay at a consistent tempo over and
Yeah.
over and over again. And that allows them to train that relax over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Because if you can't relax, you're going to use a lot of oxygen. You use a lot of oxygen, you're going to be fucking tired.
Yeah, and quite honestly, I think I have very few athletes that are ready to progress into using a kettlebell for like exclusive power, right? Like getting heavy and being able to like actually unload your hips in a kettlebell swing. You have to, for two things, you have to actually have such a good technical understanding of the kettlebell swing, and then you have to be able to access that immediately. Almost all of the people I've ever trained, when you start kettlebell swinging, it takes them 3 or 4 reps to even get into the rhythm of a kettlebell swing, right? And so a lot of my athletes live from like a 12 to 20 rep range with my kettlebells, right? And then that's where we can progress from, similar to what we said with the med balls, into some more of the power things. And then plus, I think there's some better exercises if we're trying to maximize power output,
Yeah, for
through your
sure.
hips. I think
Yeah.
we can transition to some more plyometric type of variables, or like actually throwing a med ball, a kettlebell, or whatever we're doing. I
Just
think
chuck
they're
a fucking kettlebell.
I've seen I've seen some YouTube clips on people chucking like, 18 pounds or like 12-pound kettlebells. It's like,
Yeah.
that looks cool and fun to do, but you're doing it on a football field and goodbye anybody else's ankles, bro.
Well,
Like,
you could do it with like a sandbell. I've done
yeah.
that with sandbell. Like instead of doing like a med ball sky toss, I've done it with like a forward projection with like a 20-pound sandbell.
Yeah. And I like those variables rather than trying to get, or as we get into some of the variety of our kettlebell swings we're talking about, I really like band resisted kettlebell swings. I
Yeah.
think those add tension over speed, kind of the eccentric, which enhances the brace, or requires more out of the brace at the bottom. Then you have to generate more power coming up. It's a speed element versus a load and resistance element.
Right. It's like I said, there's a lot of different ways that you can use this exercise to progress your athletes. And the band over assist is like those are one of the best ways you can. It trains that bracing strategy. It forces you to be comfortable in the hole and then
Yeah.
be comfortable under tension at the top of the movement. So it
Yeah.
really reinforces that double impulse theory. I use a fuck ton of rotational kettlebell swings.
Mm-hmm.
So or they're also called pendulum swings, where it kind of looks like a metronome going, or like a grandfather clock going back and forth, where we're rotating our hips through, going into the side to side movement. So that's something you don't ever want to start with, like we'll say a heavy rotational
Yeah.
swing. I've seen people mess that up where they're like, oh, I can use the same weight I use for a normal kettlebell swing. And then they just shear their back and then they see me for treatment the next day because their fucking spine hurts. But it's a great way to build up that rotational capacity. And then once you have the rotational capacity of doing it for sets of 10, 12, 15, or timed sets, then we can start to layer on our power on top of it. It honestly, everything we're talking about so far comes down to a similar concept. If we can pattern an exercise, we can build everything around it. It's just picking the right exercises that you can use for multiple different intents.
Yeah, 100%. And then, yeah, being able to lateralize, like, is, I think, a skill that we take for granted, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like, where do I take this X exercise and where can I get like an auxiliary benefit from it? Like, we talked about banded, we talked about lateral swings or rotational swings, that is. We talk about single handed, we talk about,
Dude, I think that's something that we take for granted a lot because we do this every day. We can lateralize in our sleep,
right.
unfortunately. Like that legitimately, like I can lateralize, like you could tell me, and I have lists in my head of what I can move to. If you're somebody at home and you try this, like that's probably one of the best skills you can have if you're building your own workouts or trying to build your own workouts or learn how to do this. Having a good list of lateralizations of I'm trying to train this quality, what exercises can get me there and what do I need in order for it to be competent. That's one of the best things you can possibly have as something trying to either get into strength and conditioning or run your own strength and conditioning.
Yeah, I think, and this is kind of a tangent, and we'll get back off it quick, but I think you just said it really subtly, that's the key, right? Is I'm not trying to train this body part. I'm not trying to train this exercise. I'm not trying to train this movement. I'm trying to train this quality, right? And to that end, you have so many different tools that you're variable, or like, oh shit, I broke my big toe doing jujitsu 3 days ago, but I got a power training day. I guess I can't jump anymore. Okay,
Cool.
jumping doesn't feel great. We can train power a lot of different ways,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so creating those pathways, I think, like you said, that's like the secret sauce of your like strength coach, is that They're looking at qualities and how can we accomplish the goal versus how can we do this exercise or how can I train this body part or how can I just go fucking ham, right?
Right. Well, and that's what I think honestly, that's what I think these podcasts are good for. That's why I wanted to do this like follow up to it. We're not trying to say back squats are bad. Like I don't use a whole bunch of back squats, but like they're not bad. I'm not trying to say trap bar deadlifts regulars are bad. They are the basics and they are the fundamentals of what we do. But all 10 movements we're going to talk about between the first podcast to this podcast are all lateralizations to where, say something gets in the way of you being able to do that.
Yeah.
These are fucking awesome options
Yeah.
that you can go into and you can get the exact same result just in a little bit different of an exercise that may be better for your body.
And I think one of those better exercises that people overlook all the time is a lateralization off of a squatting pattern, right?
100%.
A lot of people go to goblet squat, then we go to front squat, then back squat, then, whatever your preferred modality is. I think people skip this squat because it's very hard to stabilize, number one, but it's so good for your entire system. And you don't get that typical reaction to a front squat of, oh, my wrists don't let me do this. My lats are too tight, blah, 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 blah. It's like, okay, let's go to this, which is still using the kettlebells, your dual kettlebell front rack squat, right?
Yep.
So you're holding both kettlebells, elbows are up tall, hands are in the middle of your chest. We're stabilizing the kettlebells in that front rack position. We get into our squatting stance and we just perform squats, which is a really fucking hard exercise if you
100%.
have not done this at home.
Yeah.
It is challenging to no end.
It's an exercise that's extremely underutilized because one of two things. One, not every gym has double kettlebells at each weight. So some people are like, "Oh, I can't even do that." Totally fine. Do a goblet then. But secondly, they're hard. They're really hard because it forces you. The thing about a front squat, if you're doing a barbell front squat, you could cheat through one shoulder or the other. You could cheat through one wrist or the other. You could cheat through a bunch of different ways. A double kettlebell front rack squat, whether it's a stable squat, a B squat, or a split squat, it forces you to do it correctly. Otherwise, you're falling backwards, falling forwards, not able to stabilize. So I like the double front kettlebell racks because it forces both shoulders to carry the brunt of the load. You can't cheat through one or the other.
And you get a little less of like that extension compression stabilizing strategy, right? You get less arching through your lower back to hold the weight because the kettlebells aren't necessarily resting on like your anterior delts and your collarbone. They're resting in a little pocket of your bicep and forearm. Mm-hmm. So I truly have to use my shoulder flexion and my like postural strength to maintain that. So I think a kettlebell front rack is a prerequisite to teaching like a barbell front rack.
I agree.
Because if you're really good at a kettlebell front rack, you'll be better at the barbell front rack instead of, like Austin said, cheating through the barbell front rack.
Yeah. And again, I like to say it again. It's not that the barbell front rack is wrong. I think it's a great exercise, but I think the kettlebells are a little bit more dynamic of a movement where it allows for more individualization and more focus on the small fine-tuned details.
Yeah.
If you're doing a barbell front rack, I know myself, right? I know my left wrist isn't as strong as my right wrist because I snapped it while I was wrestling. And no amount of rehab that I've ever done has ever gotten it back to the same level. So if I do a barbell front rack, I always cheat through my right wrist, which then puts more stress on my right shoulder. If I do it with a double kettlebell front rack, I do not feel that same stimulus. I can load it up the same way, and I'm able to accomplish the pattern in the exact same fashion without the extra feeling of torquing of my right shoulder. Okay. Yeah. The second thing, if you're doing a double kettlebell front rack, or like, again, any squat, straight squat, B squat, or split squat, I've found very high success rates with my athletes with giving them a little bit of a heel lift. That a lot of people have trouble getting to the bottom of a hole with a front rack, like any sort of front rack, but especially with kettlebells for whatever reason. I think it's just the weight distribution of being a little bit farther in front. If you give yourself a 5-degree heel lift, you're able to get way more out of that movement. Now, that's not to say that to stay there forever, right? Yeah. But if the goal of the movement is to add strength on top of a pattern, then there's nothing wrong with elevating the heel. If the goal of the movement is to try to gain ankle range of motion and we're trying to load that pattern, then take the fucking heel lift away. Yeah. But if the goal is strength, don't be afraid to add in something that allows you to get more strength on top of that movement.
Yeah, I think there's one roadblock to what you just said, right? If we make this goal of the movement to add some range of motion, I think we have to have the understanding of like achieving more range of motion is not the way to that goal, right?
Right.
Because what I'll see a lot of times is like, all right, I want to add depth to my squat. I want to, squat better in a sense or whatever. So we'll just fucking send it into the hole,
Right.
right?
Oh,
And you're
fucking
just compensating
blowing
17 different
backs.
ways,
Yeah.
right? And so if a goal is to add ankle dorsiflexion into your front rack kettlebell squat, I think that's a great goal. But we have to understand the limitations of the movement and then like push the end range. This is one thing that I tell a lot of my athletes is I want a little stretch at the bottom. I don't want you to feel like you're gaining range of motion. I don't want you to feel like more knee bend or anything like this. I want you to maintain your rigid positions and feel a little stretch,
Yeah.
right?
And
Because
add ISOs. Like
yeah,
add time under
love it.
tension. That's something I do tremendously. If we're
Yeah,
trying to gain range of motion, your brain has to understand that movement is safe.
yeah,
How do we do that? We can do more reps, like we've talked about earlier, or we can add more time. Those are the best ways for my brain to recognize a movement or a quality is safe.
it's safe. Yeah,
Well, I can get to the bottom of that movement. I can give it a 3 or 4 second ISO and I can play with weight distribution. I can see, do I need to be more on my toes, more on my heels to maintain that depth even more efficiently? And that's what I
yeah,
like about being able to figure out range of motion problems because it allows you more movement exploration. The more movement
yeah.
exploration, the more application into the sport because your brain isn't just doing it for a kettlebell front squat.
Yeah.
It's understanding, oh, this is what's safe and effective. It's going to translate into, oh, I'm in the exact same position when I'm trying to take somebody down on the cage. My hips are underneath. I have somebody in front of me. This is safe versus
Yeah.
this is off balance.
Yeah, and it's a super funny feeling, and some people will be able to empathize with this. Is like when you get into doing isometrics and you get past the thought process of this is painful and hard.
Yep.
Like once you push past that, or you've done the isometrics so many times that's a given. Like yeah, this is going to be hard. It's going to be painful. To see where your mind goes. My mind goes to like the most minute feelings in my fingertips and my elbows, and like what is my body feeling through this? And again, it's a little weird to say, but like my mind goes a lot of different places other than this is hard and painful. It's like, okay, what am I actually feeling during this exercise? How do I stabilize better? Where's the little corrections that I can feel within my body versus just like, oh shit, this hurts until it doesn't. Right.
Dude, I kind of think about that like, you ever done a headspace meditation?
Yeah.
Like where you're laying there and they're telling you feel it to the tips of your toes and it goes
Yeah.
up to the knee. Dude, it's almost like active meditation when I'm doing like a heavy ISO, say like 20,
Mhm.
30 seconds and like low minimal weight. I start to think about like, oh, this is what I feel in my big toe. Oh, I feel this in my shoulder.
And you have to be that intentional about it because I swear or I promise you, the millisecond that your head wanders off into like, where's my happy place or look at the ceiling or whatever, as soon as you do that, your body compensates.
100%.
Your
Yeah,
body's
you're
like,
fucked.
let's find an easier way to do this. All right, fuck that ankle, all right.
Yep.
So I think being that intentional with your isometrics is huge. What other isometric I really like for the dual kettlebell front rack is just carries, right? And you have to be disciplined in the carries. Like as you're walking, a lot of people tend to like lean back and start to carry low, like they're trying to carry a huge box up the stairs or something. But when we're holding those kettlebells, be conscious of keeping the ribs tucked and maintaining like that good relationship between your ribs and the pelvis. That I've found is a really good alternative to the carry and can transfer into your kettlebell front rack squat.
100%. And then on the same concept of like ISOs, our number 4 is going to be one of the least trained qualities. This is why we're talking about some concepts today, or concepts in strength and conditioning, especially for combat sports, is implementing a contrast, but not necessarily strength to power. It is, but it's not. A
Yeah.
different type of strength. I like to add in, I do it with almost all of my combat athletes, is isometric heavy ISOs right into some sort of plyometric movement. Because there is nothing more similar to cage work or jujitsu than a heavy ISO right into an explosive movement.
Yep.
And while sport specific training, we know oh, it's a myth. There's nothing that can simulate a sport in strength and conditioning, blah, blah, blah. We can still train concepts that are
And
similar to the
qualities. Yeah.
sport. Because as I'm trying to prepare my athletes for what's going on, I do my needs analysis. Well, what's a major needs analysis of anybody in a grappling sport? Say you take a shot, you get sprawled on, you're holding onto that arm or onto that leg, you're stuck underneath somebody, and you have to time your knee slide up into your takedown perfectly. I might be there for 10 seconds or somebody's sprawling on me. We're stuck at a standstill. And then I need to be able to explode out of the hole, get to my movement, and then hit my cut double or I'm going to go a throw by or something along those lines where I'm getting to my next attack. But it's not always immediate. Sometimes I get stuck underneath somebody. Think about on the cage. I'm stuck in a body lock. We're playing that give and take of tension relationships. And then I need to time my power move, whether I'm going to do a body lock, I'm going for a throw, whether I'm going to, boom, drop to a double, hands locked, pull them off the cage, whether I'm going to push, pull, shuck it by over the top. All of those come from anywhere between a 10 to 15 to an even a 20-second ISO right into a power movement. Well, while I can't train, I can, but I'm not going to have them body lock me on the cage. That's not what I'm going to use for strength and conditioning. I can train the concept of we're holding something for a prolonged period of time, and then we're going to explode right out of that hole to train them to be able to hold, explode, hold, explode, hold, explode. It's just a different type of contrast that's not used typically in most strength and conditioning routines.
Absolutely. And one of the primary examples, or a really good example, I've been able to see throughout my strength and conditioning experience for this, and actually going to credit Gavin Pratt from the USCPI.
Dude, Gav's the man.
Exactly. You're pressing and holding a med ball like in a stagger stance, almost like a cage, like double against the wall. You're pushing your body into the med ball, pinning it to the wall, right? You hold that for 10, 15, 20 seconds, whatever it is. And then on the coach's cue or at time, you take the med ball back away and launch that thing into the wall as hard as you can, right? That's exactly what you're describing here. Is like, I'm holding somebody on the cage, I'm pummeling. Okay, time to break and throw an elbow over the top, right? That's literally what happens there. And that's like such a good example of Anatoly Bondarchuk's work, transfer of training to sport, which he did it with track and field, which is a way more controllable circumstance. But you can look at that. How do we progress from the most general exercise of throwing a med ball for intense power, or even backstep that to what we were talking about, extensive power? Okay, we throw it for intensity. Okay, how hard can you throw this med ball? Let's train that quality. We get closer to a fight. Okay, now let's put a stagger stance into it, and maybe we even add like a plyometric little hop back into it, right? We do a little extensive plyo with our feet into the power with the hands. Okay, that's one way to progress it. Now we get closer into camp. Let's make it more sport specific or towards looking like the sport. Now we add this like press into the wall, into a back step, into an unload of the med ball, right? That's literally your progress from general to specific within this isometric to power type of contrast, right? And so I think that principle holds a lot of value, but people overlook it a ton because the textbooks say contrast is max strength and max power.
Right. And this is where being a chef's different than being a cook. If all you do is read the NSCA book, you're only going to contrast with max strength, max power. Boom. There you go. Yeah. That's it. But there's so many different ways to try to play with performance. That's the fun part about our job, is trying to maximize what your athlete is capable of. That's our job in a nutshell. It's how do I make them even better than what they are today on physicality and on strength and on power. Yeah. Well, an easy way, like Alex already talked about, like the med ball example. If you don't have any equipment, you can still do this concept at home. Yeah. You could hold the bottom of a push-up. Do that 15, 20. I mean, 30 seconds is a long fucking bottom of push-up hold. But like, we talked about Tommy Gunn already. Like yesterday, part of Tommy Gunn, he's preparing for Contender Series on September 3rd. Anyways, so he's fighting this kid. Yesterday, part of his training, he's holding down 30-second max push-up ISO. Right away, we're going right into 3 plyo push-ups. We know this kid is a grappler. We know, okay, he's going to want to probably grapple. Okay, cool. We'll prepare. Hold an ISO, and then be able to explode right out of the hole. You can do that at home. You don't need equipment for that. Yeah. We're going to do a max push-up hold right at the end of your push-up hold before dropping to the ground or before actually pushing yourself up. Boom, 2, 3, 4 explosive movements to chain together plyometrics right after. Yeah. You can do it with pull-ups where you're doing a pull-up hold as long as you can. Okay, boom, on the way down, as soon as you're done, you're going to drop 2 speed pull-ups, 3 speed pull-ups, something along those lines where we're trying to train qualities that are similar to the sport with that ISO into power.
Well, another example, defense on the cage.
Yeah.
Hold a split squat for, 20, 30 seconds, max ISO, and then do some split squat jumps or scissor jumps, right? Right after it, right? That's literally split squatting for your cage defense. And then as soon as you get an area to breathe, transitioning and pummeling up to get out, right? So
Yeah.
I think, huge concept that is not like textbook official, but is tied into our practice leading our research, right?
100%. And then, Alex, what's the last thing?
The last thing that we hope validates a lot of people doing this, and we don't take wind from the sails of it being too old school or nonsense. One thing Austin and I do the most uh, frequently with our athletes is jump rope. A simple jump rope, right? This
Old school
checks
boxing.
so many boxes for us, right? It's the eccentric plyometrics, it's the tendon elasticity, it's the repetitive conditioning motion. Like the simple jump rope has so many key transfers, right? And we talk about this too. Like whoever figured out boxing, whoever was the mastermind of like this combination and 1, 2, 3 and jump rope or road work or whatever, they had a really good set of biomechanical principles governing their thoughts, whether they realize it or not. But that shit makes sense, right? What are you doing in your MMA stances? You're constantly doing eccentric plyometrics, stepping, bouncing, throwing combinations, loading, this and that. What are you doing in a jump rope? Constantly bouncing, loading, eccentric or not eccentric, extensive plyometrics as you go, right?
But jump rope is one of the most similar movements to especially the lower weights and how they have to move in an MMA fight.
Yeah.
And it's not just MMA; it's any striking exchange, but even wrestling too. But for the most part, those extensive plyos that we talked about in the last one, with why we think pogo hops are so important, that's what jump rope can do. But we can train that with an implement. It's almost like adding a constraint to where instead of doing a pogo hop forward or on a springboard like I typically do at the gym, like we're doing it just with a jump rope. So we add the timing element of we have to time ourselves over and over and over again so we can find rhythm with those extensive plyometrics.
Yeah.
That rhythm is super important because it allows me to be able to explode and can explode, relax. That is very similar to trying to time a striking exchange.
Yeah. And just like every other exercise that we're talking about here too, is add some variety with it, add some variables, right? I've been so surprised by how much I can toast my athletes by telling them to jump rope on one leg, right? Jump rope with your right leg. And I'm not kidding you, it's 20 or 30 seconds. And they're fucking, oh my God, my cramp. Oh, I can't do that. It's
Yep.
like, all right, that is a weakness that we've exposed that needs to be worked on, right?
For
And
sure.
so
Yep.
add some variety with your jump rope. Plus, it just makes it interesting. You know, a lot of people get into like these jump rope routines, or like I've had one fighter that did 5-minute jump roping rounds, and it's like, okay, don't always do that, but
That's a recipe for shin splints.
I was like, don't always do that, but if you need that for your mental right now, okay. But
Where do you throw jump rope into your workouts?
I love it in warm up. I think warm up is super key. It's like it's an easier introductory exercise. You're not going to spend a million hours doing it. And I also like it within some of my metabolic circuits, right? To kind of active rest as we get closer to end of camp. But yeah, those are probably my two biggest areas: warm up, and then it's like active recovery.
Same. Yeah, I think it's a perfect implementation of getting the heart rate elevated and training an extensive plyometric all in one.
Yeah.
So whether it's in my actual warm-up block or it's a part of my extensive block, either one of those is typically where I throw it. I don't do it as much in the conditioning modality, but I like the idea of adding that as like I do a lot of shadow boxing with my like active recovery, but
Yep.
throwing jump rope in that's just as good.
Yep. Totally.
Yeah, jump rope, everybody. So if you guys got to get in touch with us, or you want to learn more about our top, I guess now it's top 10 most underrated concepts and exercises for combat sports, hit us up at buildingafighter.com, at buildingafighter on Instagram, or buildingafighter on YouTube. If you're looking for the previous episode, I believe it's about 15 before this one, maybe 15 or 20. So go check that out. It's on Spotify, Apple, or it's also on YouTube, I believe, as well. So if you aren't watching the podcast, we do have them available to see our pretty faces on YouTube now too. So I think our last 15 podcasts are all available on YouTube at Building a Fighter. So check that out as well. Boost those SEO numbers, get us some more subscribers because YouTube's been popping. If you're looking for any strength and conditioning programming, that's going to be at buildingafighter.com. And that's going to be our preset options, our membership options, and our custom options where we can design a program for you, for your team, or for your gym based around whatever weight equipment you have access to and the goals that you have. And as always, it's Dr. Austin Shane.
Alex Friedman.
And we are out.